Right, so where to begin? Well, I don't want to go into too much detail on the background of the Battle of the Somme, because ultimately we cover that in quite a lot of other tours. And we've got Battle Guide has a number of tours focusing on the 1st of July. And as I said previously, my big interest in the Battle of the Ancre is the fact that it comes at the end of the Battle of the Somme. So what we're going to do is just briefly take a look at how things stood after 4 to 5 months of fighting in the area. The opening phase of the battle had seen some substantial gains in the southern sectors, with British and French forces capturing the villages of Montauban and Mametz. These successes faded towards the centre and the northern end of the attacking line. So the further we went up that Somme frontage, the less well the advances were. And obviously, quite famously, we know the 1st of July, of course, did not go to plan. What happened during July and August was basically the Allies tried to chip away at German lines. So there were successes at Byzantine Ridge, Pozières, and Gonchy eventually as well. And Haig had pretty much accepted that by this point, a breakthrough or any kind of significant, huge advance was going to be unlikely. And so he very much saw this as an attempt to essentially wear the Germans down, to exhaust them, really a battle of attrition in the truest sense of the word, in order to kind of get them on the back foot for the next planned large offensive. And that was going to come from Rawlinson's 4th Army around about mid-September, and that was the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. And that saw, of course, the Canadian Corps' first action on the Somme, and it resulted in the capture of so many very, very important strategic places such as Flers, Grandcourt, Le Boeuf, and also Morval. So basically what we're looking at is chipping away throughout July and August, taking those little nibbles, trying to grind the Germans down, and then this pretty big success, pretty sizable success in September. Costly, but some gains were finally being made. Today, though, we are going to be focusing on the 5th Army under the ever controversial Hubert Goss. And they were originally the Reserve Army, and they were renamed on the 30th of October 1916. And they'd been heavily involved in operations to capture the high ground immediately south of the River Ancre. In September, they had attempted to capture the high ground on Thiepval Ridge, which of course we are familiar with now through the great mighty Thiepval Memorial, which sits across there overlooking pretty much the whole of the Somme battlefield. So they attempted to capture the ridge. They had fair success there, but they hadn't managed to capture the whole ridge, and that was largely due to the big German strong point there called the Schwaben Redoubt. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the term redoubt, but if you're not, it essentially just means a really, really strong defensive position. And this had basically prevented any further action south of the river. It was an extremely fortified position, it was on high ground, and so it had complete view of everything that was going on. The Germans put up this big fierce resistance. Large proportion, I should say, of Schwaben was captured, but they did cling on to the other side of it essentially. And so operations by the British were extended into November, the Battle of Ancre Heights, which precedes the action that we're going to be looking at today. And what we're going to do now is just have a look at a bit of drone footage. And we are going to be looking at now from the site of the Schwaben Redoubt. And we're going to see just how important this area was to the success of any operations north of the Ancre. And as we go across this drone footage, what you'll see is a few places that we've flagged. We've got Newfoundland Memorial Park up there. We've got the villages of Beaumont-Hamel, Beaucourt as well, and the River Ancre, which sits just below this. We've got this line of trees here, and just below this hill as we're creeping over, you'll see the river down below. And we're going to be looking at today the area essentially near that yellow field you can see in the distance. But you can see this basically, anybody that holds this height, you've got full view of anything that's happening north of the river. So I just wanted to take a moment to just explain why this side of the river was very important to anything that was going on the other side. So what was the plan? Well, Haig wanted a new offensive in the area north of the river, and he authorised Goss to move forward with operations basically as soon as the weather allowed, because the weather had turned pretty darn awful by October time. There were several strategic reasons for this last action. And this has kind of been spoken about and debated by historians over the decades. I'm going to give you the three main reasons that are often cited. Firstly, by continuing to engage the Germans quite heavily on the Western Front, it reduced the likelihood of them reinforcing their troops on the Russian and Romanian fronts. And this was where the Allies had come under fairly significant pressure. So again, this was a diversionary effort to get the guys, German army, really kind of distracted essentially from those fronts. Secondly, the third Chantilly conference was planned for the 15th of November, and Haig wanted to very much reassure Britain's allies, particularly the French, of course, that the British were still committed to the aims of the first and second Chantilly conference. And those aims are essentially just that attacks would be coordinated and everybody would be working for this common aim to undermine the Central Powers and mutually support one another. And that was, of course, one of the main reasons why the Battle of the Somme was begun in the first place, to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. Finally, the other reason that is often kind of brought forward for this final action on the Somme here was that, the Somme, back at home, there'd been a lot of propaganda back on the British home front, but the Somme had been a tricky one. It had a number of kind of downsides. There were huge casualties, and Haig was really suffering with a bit of a PR situation going on. So they wanted to end the Battle of the Somme on an inverted commas, a good note, and help to ease those political tensions after the many, many months of slow progress and the drop in morale of the civilian population. The ultimate aim then of this assault north of the Ancre was to break through the first three German lines in the area and take the villages of Beaucourt, Beaumont-Hamel and Serre. And of course, this is hallowed ground. This is familiar ground. Anybody who knows anything about the 1st of July will know these places were all attacked during that first day. And the British had failed to make any progress since July. This sector of the Somme had remained more or less exactly the same as it was 5 months earlier. In July, the PALS battalions of the 31st Div had been brutally beaten off at Serre, and the 29th Div, they didn't fare much better at Hamel and the surrounding areas. And so this time, the effort came from 5 Corps, from the 63rd Div, 51st, 2nd, 37th in reserve, and the 3rd Div as shown here on the map. And we are going to be focusing, of course, on the 63rd Royal Naval Division. These guys would be supported additionally by the 4th Canadian Expeditionary Force, the 18th Division, the 19th Division of 2 Corps, and finally the 39th Division, who had actually been transferred from 5 Corps in early October. And they'd be attacking from the Schwaben Redoubt that we saw earlier towards the southern bank of the Ancre, with the aim to capture ruins of the hamlet of St Pierre Divion and provide that secure flank for the RND. So just going to take a quick moment to look at the lay of the land, and we've added in a overlay here, which I just think is fantastic. It's been a while since I've done a Battle Guide virtual tour. I've been off the roster for a few months, and the tech has come on massively, and this is incredible. What we're looking at here is an overlay showing the trenches as they were in July 1916, and you can see quite clearly here the ground is pocked with craters from artillery. And the reason why I want to show you these overlays, and there's a couple of them in the tour, is just because we're going to be looking at Google Earth, but obviously, that's not what the ground looked like at the time. And it can just be a little bit difficult to keep that in mind. So this provides a brilliant way just to show you how featureless it was and the damage to the ground. And if we go in a little bit further, what we're looking at now is going to be the view from the 63rd Royal Naval Division, who were tasked with taking Beaucourt. And the land, you can see, will be sloping down towards the Ancre and slightly up towards Beaucourt. On the 63rd Division's left flank were the 51st Highland Division, and they were tasked with capturing Beaumont-Hamel. And again, we've got a nice overlay here just to highlight the trenches as they were. And they were assisted by the 2nd Division, who were north of this German salient that had been created and kind of withstood there since July. And this isn't our area of focus today, but in order to understand just how torn up the ground is, and this is something that I'm going to keep coming back to, I want to look again at a superimposed image, which will be coming up shortly. And this photo was actually taken on the 12th of November 1916, so just before the Battle of the Ancre. And it shows the German reserve trenches and the positions that were attacked by 3rd Division. And just look at this landscape here. You can see the damage and how ripped up the ground was. The white and black really highlighting those craters and just the size of them, frankly. And we've got the village of Serre in the distance, where the Pounds battalions suffered so greatly at the beginning of July. And it's worth bearing in mind as well here that the guys that were attacking, they were attacking in not just over kind of this kind of, I don't know, almost like a lunar landscape, but it was full of mud. This area of the Somme doesn't drain particularly well. The weather had been awful. So they were going in on mud, you know, at times it was like up to their waists. So, you know, you can imagine trying to move in that. It's just incredibly difficult, hard enough to survive, never mind fight. So try and imagine that kind of landscape, basically as far as the eye can see. Okay, so we've taken a bit of time to understand where the British were at by November, but what about the Germans? And it's important to look at this. We often tend to ignore what was going on with the Germans on the Somme. Obviously, particularly in Britain, we're very focused on what the Allies were doing. But, you know, to really understand it, you need to also understand where the Germans were by November. Basically, the sustained attacks, that chipping away, had left the German army in a very difficult position. They'd lost a huge number of their heavy artillery and their field guns, and September had seen their heaviest month of casualties throughout the Somme. So they had lost, I think it's something like 130,000 men in September alone. A huge, huge number. They'd lost the majority of the high ground at Thiepval, so most of their rear area was open now to British observation. They had lost a lot of that upper hand of having that high ground. And on top of this, much like the British, they were facing huge, huge difficulties maintaining supplies to their frontline troops over what was an increasingly devastated landscape. And as a result, morale was suffering big time. You know, imagine what it must have been like for the average German soldier. You're facing these sustained attacks that are not letting up. They're coming day after day after day, grinding you down. You've got bombardments, you're having to take cover, you're maybe not seeing much of the daylight, you're living in difficult conditions. And to top it all off, you're running short on those little home comforts, which we know are vital for maintaining fighting spirit. And we're talking about things like food, we're talking about mail and cigarettes. These guys having, you know, a puff on their pipe and a cigarette. All this stuff makes a huge difference to an army as it operates. It's essentially, you know, it's almost as vital as ammunition in many regards. Add into the mix of this the pressure that the German army was feeling with French counterattacks at Verdun, the Brusilov offensive. Basically, the German army, come November, was very, very stretched. So, in an effort to turn things around, to mix it up a bit, the German Chief of Staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, he'd become increasingly unpopular. And I kind of use the analogy, it sounds a bit glib, but it's, you know, it's a bit like, you know, you've got a football team, they're doing really badly. Well, often the manager takes the blame. Falkenhayn was increasingly becoming this figure of hatred, basically, by political enemies. They were starting to, you know, draw out their knives, and long-term rival Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff, they took control. They ousted Falkenhayn, essentially, and they took control of all decision-making. So basically what happened in Germany at this point was they became a military dictatorship in pretty much everything but name. So Hindenburg, Ludendorff, they were calling all of the shots. The area that we're going to be looking at today, so north of the Ancre, was the German First Army, and they were under Prussian General Fritz von Below. Both he and Field Marshal Rupprecht knew that the British were going to be planning some kind of attack between Grandcourt and the Ancre. They didn't know exactly where, they didn't know specifically what was going to happen or when, but they knew something was coming. And I just got to take a minute here to congratulate Fritz von Below on his fabulous moustache. It's one of my favourites from the First World War. So there were some disagreements basically with German command at this point. Ruprecht, he favoured a withdrawal from Beaumont-Hamel and St Pierre Divion to essentially straighten the German line, because at this point in time, the Germans essentially had a salient, they had a bump in their front line. Ruprecht wanted to draw back, straighten that line out. He argued, that this was going to be safer, this was going to be easier to defend. But von Below had a different idea, and he argued that a withdrawal from these positions would put the German army at a disadvantage, because it would mean them giving up their last remaining bits of high ground. So they would, they've already lost quite a lot here, and they'd be basically giving up any kind of advantage on the high ground that they had. And that would basically mean they'd forfeit any opportunity to observe what the British were getting up to. And this might sound like a bit of a foolish approach, hanging on to this salient, because we know, of course, from Ypres that it's very difficult to defend a salient because you're fighting essentially on three sides. But this kind of fits in line with the change in German defensive tactics at the time that Hindenburg and Ludendorff brought with them. And just to briefly touch on that, their aim had been to reduce casualties and bolster defences. And so what they sought to do was to deepen German defences with a more flexible front line, an elastic front line that would be lightly manned but movable. And the idea was that compared to a very strongly fortified front line, this kind of defence in depth, as it's often known, would expose fewer men to initial artillery bombardments and barrages. So you'd have fewer casualties in that initial moments of the battle. And secondly, it would allow for planned withdrawals quickly to a second rear line, which would basically overstretch the enemy. So, you would lose your attacking momentum if suddenly your point of aim drops backwards. It would be a bit like, and I'm an equestrian historian among other things, so it would be essentially like riding a blown horse in a cavalry charge. Once your horse is at puff, you're suddenly there and you are essentially exposed to a counterattack. So that was the idea of having this maneuverable front line, this defense in depth. When you think about it, this makes a great deal of sense. And so in this vein, the Germans actually decided to hang on to this small salient and to reinforce it and restructure their front line. As we've mentioned, and of course made clear already, we are going to be looking at the Royal Naval Division, who are utterly unique in the First World War. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about these guys because they are my favourite division. I think it's really important to know the history of the division and understand a bit about their character, because this makes all the difference in this battle. So the Royal Naval Division were formed at the beginning of the war from Marine and Navy reservists who were not needed at sea. In August 1914, the 3 Marine and Naval brigades that had been raised were formed into a sort of a division, but not quite. There were 8 battalions, and they were all uniquely named after famous naval commanders. So you had Drake Battalion, Benbow, Hawke, Nelson, Anson, Hood, Howe, and Collingwood. And the R&D first saw action at Antwerp in 1914, so they were straight out the gates. And they later went to Gallipoli, very famously. En route there, one of their most famous cohorts, poet Rupert Brooke, died of sepsis. He was hurriedly buried at Skyros, story for another time. The R&D at Gallipoli, fought with great distinction. They fought at Anzac Cove, Cape Helles, and they were evacuated in January 1916. By July 1916, they were transferred to the army. And this is the kicker, basically. They were brought up to full strength, so a couple of army battalions were added. We had 1st Honourable Artillery Company, 4th Bedfords, 7 Royal Fusiliers, and 10th Dublin Fusiliers, forming the 190th Brigade. And they had divisional artillery added, transport, and all those kind of things, and they were reconstituted as the 63rd Royal Naval Division. What makes them special is that even though they were placed under control of the army, it was agreed that the Royal Naval Division would retain their legal status as sailors, but they would retrain as soldiers, and this would cause a lot of friction. Place yourselves in the shoes of these guys. if you join the R&D from the outset, you've been trained in accordance to naval rules. Your esprit de corps was very much shaped by being part of that senior service. And many ex-Royal Naval and Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve soldiers actually joined thinking that they would spend the war at sea, not on land. They find out that actually they're going to be fighting on land. That was, at first a great disappointment, and they really, they rose to the challenge together. They thought, okay, well, this is what's come our way. We're gonna give it our best, and that cemented their solidarity as a division. This kind of sailors, but we can do it all kind of attitude. They were immensely proud of their history as a naval force, and what stood them apart from those army divisions around them. For example, they kept things like their naval ranks. They were allowed to grow beards. They used a different language. So basically when they were on leave, they said that they'd gone ashore. They called, first aid post, they called it sick bay. So all these kind of little things had become very much part of their culture. And as I kind of alluded to before, many of the officers and men were particularly quirky and unusual. And one such chap who's going to be helping us tell the story tonight is Douglas Jerrold. He's a very interesting man. He joined the Royal Naval Division as a lieutenant in Hawk Battalion. And later, actually, after the war, he became a huge fascist sympathiser. He was instrumental in taking Franco from the Canary Islands to Morocco, which obviously kick-started the Spanish Civil War. So he had a very, very interesting war. This photo, I think it's one of my favourite portraits ever, by the way. It's just slightly terrifying. But Douglas Jerrold is a really, really interesting man. I could talk about him for hours. It's not why we're here today, but I had to include quite a lot of his story, basically, because he really brings to life what the Royal Naval Division was all about. And here he is sharing his thoughts on the impact of the R&D's unique ethos as it joined the army.
It needs scarcely to be said that these manifestations inspired in a certain type of military mind feelings of the liveliest alarm. To this type of mind, anything which diverged in the slightest degree from absolute uniformity according to the sealed pattern was inexpressibly painful. Yet these peculiarities of the Naval Division, this consciousness they had of partnership with the great traditions of the Royal Navy, these odd forms and ceremonies, this special nomenclature which were cherished and preserved so punctiliously by officers and men, few of whom have ever been to sea, were in fact the mainspring of their exceptional prowess.
So the truth is, the army did not really know what to do with the R&D to fully assimilate them. They had a lot of strong characters, and this kind of was incongruous with the idea of the army, basically. But in October 1916, an opportunity presented itself when General Archibald Paris, who had commanded the division from the outset, was wounded and a new CO was appointed. And he was appointed with basically the aim of bringing a degree of uniformity to the men. His name was Cameron Shute. He was a veteran of Sudan in the 1880s. And unlike Paris, who had been very much a Marine through and through, Shute was a straight-laced, fit and polished army man, and he had absolutely no time whatsoever for the R&D's nautical traditions. This portrait of him, really captures what he was all about as far as I'm concerned. As you can imagine, Shute's attitude and his kind of goals didn't fit very well with what the R&D were hoping for. And so let's hear from Jerrold again. And this time he's going to be recounting a story about another interesting character, George Peckham of Hawk Battalion, and his reaction to a visit from Major General Shute.
I was standing in a communication trench talking to George Peckham when we were surprised by the General's arrival. Foolishly, we were standing in a blind corner and there was no avenue of escape. A rain of questions descended which we were fortunately able to answer, and all seemed to be going well. Alas, the General had a habit, when standing still, of striking the ground rather forcibly with the point of his walking stick. Our trenches were innocent of duckboards, and more than ankle deep in mud. The General's stick went in deeper and deeper, till suddenly it struck something hard. Instantly there was an ominous bristling. After much kicking and scraping, a perfectly good box of ammunition was revealed. "Ammunition boxes lining the communication trenches," the General exclaimed, drafting out loud another report to Corps Headquarters on the iniquities of the Navy. "Good God, sir," cried George Peckham with a credible imitation of pietistic but tolerant horror. "I believe you're right." He stood looking at the General, who was by then quite white with rage. "And you were deliberately standing there trying to conceal it from me? It's a damned disgrace." "Good God, sir," said George with a broad smile, "if I'd known you were coming, this is the last place on earth where I should have been standing."
Okay, so hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea of what the men in the R&D were like, and I could share dozens of similar stories. And I think, you know, it's just really important to kind of highlight their character. But let's kind of get down to business now and look at what their objectives were. So the R&D were occupying a frontage of around about 1,200 yards across. That's just over a kilometre in new money. And the German front line was approximately 250 yards ahead. So again, it's about 250 metres, something like that. To their left was the 51st Division, and to their right, across the river, was the 39th. And we've got here this aerial image, and we've marked on quite painstakingly the trench lines here, as they would have been in November 1916. And what we've also got are the R&D objectives for the day that have been wonderfully put on here by Dan, and they are painstakingly accurate, let me say. And Shane will help us just scroll up slightly, and what we can see are the 5 main objectives. We have the black dotted line, the blue line, the green line, the yellow line, and a little further up, we'll see shortly, the red line. So the blue line marked essentially the last of the German frontline trenches. So of course, when we talk about frontline trenches, we're not talking about just one trench, we're talking about 2 or 3 trenches, and that blue line just ahead of the, here we go, just ahead near the road, that is the first main objective. The black line was kind of like a preliminary objective there. Behind that blue line, we've got Station Road, and that road actually runs through a valley, which we'll see kind of shortly with some drone footage, but the ground dips down and then it goes up again on the other side where the green line is the second objective. After that, we've got these fields, the ground slopes up as we look towards Beaucourt, and the third objective line was there, the yellow line that we can see. It's more or less featureless, that advance up there. And finally, the other side of Beaucourt village itself, we've got the final objective for the day, the red line. And so what we'll do now is just show you this from another perspective. We're going to look at some drone footage, which is going to help us to just visualize and see things exactly as it was for the Naval Division. And that will help us just to, you know, understand the lay of the land in a bit more detail. So just look at the challenges of the topography, essentially. And again, you can't see the lines marked on this drone footage. Actually, you can, I lie. And so we'll be able to kind of see from this side what the guys are looking at. So we're looking now from Schwaben Redoubt. We've got essentially the guys coming across. So we're looking at the battlefield from side on. And we've got those objectives there. And we can see that Station Road just dipping down there in the middle. And these men, don't forget, had been fighting in Gallipoli, where, of course, the weather and the conditions presented totally different challenges to those on the Western Front. The trenches north of the Ancre had been almost totally destroyed by the time the Royal Naval Division took up their positions in the winter of 1916. And they'd been smashed to pieces, basically, by German artillery in the months of fighting that had gone on in the area. And so there was, you know, this was a huge challenge for these guys. This is the first time they'd been on the Western Front, and they've been thrown very much in the deep end. They've come to a battlefield which has been fought over for months before. They have really limited experience of these kind of conditions. So it was a huge culture shock, if you would. There were no dugouts to speak of. The communication trenches are basically, bit of a mouthful, they've basically been blown apart, and the rain, the terrible weather had basically turned the remainder of the trench divisions into nothing but horrendously muddy ditches. And we're talking about, as I said earlier, mud sometimes up to your waist, more often than not up to your knees. And there were various other horrible elements essentially left over from the previous battle. So the detritus of the fighting that had gone on before, and the casualties and the men that had occupied these trenches. You can use your imagination to understand what that might have looked like, what it might have smelt like. In addition, the original assembly trenches that we used in July actually had a steep curve in them, which obviously wasn't ideal in terms of attack, because there was this this risk basically that the men in the assembly trenches might get disorientated and basically fall off course, because there's nothing to orientate yourself in this landscape. So General Shute, his first order of business here was to put the naval lads to work in straightening out the trenches, ensure that everything was in good order for a decent jumping off point when the attack began. And this is a good time to introduce another fellow from Hawk Battalion who you may have heard of before. His name is AP Herbert. Herbert was a prolific writer, a humorist. He wrote a lot for Punch magazine. That's before and after the war. And I couldn't not include one of my favourite First World War poems. It's not your usual fare, but some of you may be aware of it. If you're of a sensitive disposition, you might want to just close your ears. But this is a poem by Herbert in response to General Shute's outrage at the state of the R&D trenches upon his arrival.
The general, inspecting the trenches, exclaimed with a horrified shout, "I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about." But nobody took any notice. No one was prepared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared to the presence of Shute. And certain responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing that his staff advisers consisted entirely of turds. For shit may be shot at odd corners, and paper supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if someone shot that shit Shute.
Obviously, it's quite a funny poem. Don't know if it's your cup of tea. It's very much mine. And, you know, obviously Shute was going to kind of get it in the neck, asking the guys to organise this. Because to be fair to the Royal Naval Division, these were the state of the trenches when they began to occupy them. It wasn't necessarily their fault. But on the other hand, I don't disagree with Shute. Getting the trenches in good order ahead of D-Day was, you know, a perfectly acceptable, very good idea. You've got to start from a place of organisation, or you're putting yourself at a disadvantage straight away. So the attack on the Ancre had originally been planned for the 23rd of October, but it was delayed, as I've mentioned, due to poor weather. And I've pressed this point a lot because it does affect what happens afterwards. Many of you may know that another famous author was in this sector. So J.R.R. Tolkien spent time in the Ancre earlier in the year, and it was kind of said that his experience fighting on the Somme served as inspiration for the Lord of the Rings and the Ancre in particular, for the Dead Marshes. This was the haunted wetlands which Frodo and Sam had to pass through on their way to Mordor. And the footage that we've just seen there showing really those muddy conditions, and also how, you know, you couldn't get transport up to the lines very easily. You had to rely on animals, pack transport, because the ground was in such a poor state. And to kind of explain a little more about what conditions are like, I've highlighted this section here from Lord of the Rings, of Tolkien's description of the Dead Marshes. See what you think.
The marsh reeks lay in heavy banks. No sun pierced the clouded sky. It was a shadowy, silent world, an endless network of pools and soft mires and winding, half-strangled watercourses. It was dreary and wearisome. Cold, clammy winter still held sway in this forsaken country. The only green was the scum of livid weed on the dark, greasy surfaces of the sullen waters. Dead grasses and rotting reeds loomed up in the mists like ragged shadows of long-forgotten summers.
Tolkien had denied that the books were ever based on the Battle of the Somme, but when I sort of hear those words, I look at those pictures, which are of the Ancre itself. For me, like, the similarities are pretty striking. I might be a bit biased because Lord of the Rings is one of my favourite books, but yeah, I think even subconsciously there has to have been an influence there. While the work was being done to improve the trenches, General Haig came down to inspect the troops of the Naval Division. And before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of the battle, there's just one quick story I just want to share with you, because it does capture that R&D spirit again. You remember our man George Peckham? He's mentioned by Gerald earlier in that little story. Well, basically, while Haig was busy chatting away to all the officers and NCOs, Peckham had been having a jolly old time at the local bar, the local Esmenet, and he'd had one too many. Someone had come up to him and said, "Look, Haig is here. He's arrived already, and he's currently inspecting your men." At which point, Peckham literally had to leg it back to the trenches where the R&D were, and he basically arrived by bursting through a hedge in the middle of his men being inspected. He didn't make any comment, not really an apology or anything like that. He simply just said, "I'm a Marine," as if that he'd just made land. Haig took it very well, apparently, and it always just makes me chuckle because I have this image of him just kind of bursting through a hedge, a bit drunk, and ahead of the commander in chief, and it just gets me because it really kind of perfectly illustrates that congenial attitude of the Royal Naval Division, even in the toughest of circumstances. D-Day then had been set for the 13th of November, and a huge bombardment would kick off the attack. As Gerald later wrote, though, after 3 days that they'd gone through tidying up the trenches, a lot of the men agreed that there was a great deal to be said for being dead. So again, they had a really fun time getting those trenches in order. The attack would open with a fierce artillery bombardment, and it would be, really the perfect illustration of how tactics had developed in 1916. So just to touch on that, in July, the British had used approximately one field gun for every 20 metres or so. They'd used one heavy gun for every 50 metres or so to launch this huge initial bombardment that went on for a week before the attack. 1.5 million shells were launched to try and basically destroy the German defences. And the plan was that this new technique, the creeping barrage, would be employed to protect infantry on their advance on the morning of the 1st of July. Creeping barrage is basically, think of it as a curtain of artillery fire that would act to defend the attacking troops and cover them while they advanced across no man's land. However, this sounds pretty simple, I know, but there's a lot to consider. You've got to think about things like how thick is your fire cover? What type of shells are you using? How quickly does this creeping motion move across no man's land? How fast are your troops moving to keep up with it? What distances? We know, of course, that no man's land, wasn't a fixed distance across the front. It changed. And as we know, the British got a lot of this wrong on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. This time round in November, they had learned from their mistakes and they put a number of changes into action. They increased the number of artillery significantly. So they had one field gun every 12 metres rather than 20. They had one heavy gun every 28 metres rather than 50. So they basically doubled the amount of guns. And the creeping barrage kept closer to the advancing troops with a mixture of shrapnel and high explosive shells used. So the idea that would be more effective to destroy those defences on the ground. Excuse me. The attack was planned for 5:45 a.m. with the barrage acting as a guide for the men to follow towards their objectives. The R&D had been in this sector since the 6th of November, waiting to find out when this attack would take place. The weather had been taking a toll. Early on the 12th, they finally made their way to the assembly trenches. They knew that something was going on, and they began this long and painful wait for that whistle to blow. The nerves of these men had been already greatly tested despite their humour. The attack had been on, then it was off, then it was on again. The weather, the rain, the cold, all of this, this grinds you down. I can't imagine it, but I know myself when I'm pretty miserable and then going out in the rain, it's not a nice thing. So to be in that situation constantly, despite their kind of their good humour that they took it with, it really began to kind of grate the guys down. And Joe Murray of Hood Battalion, who, by the way, all of his interviews are available in the Imperial War Museum archives, which I would definitely recommend looking at if you haven't already. It's really good. And we've got an extract here voiced especially for us, and that just is a bit from his memoirs, and it recounts that wait for Z hour that the R&D had to go through.
It's extremely dark. I can't see the hands of my watch, but I can feel the dampness of the mist on my face and assume it's about midnight. I may be hopelessly in error, but it doesn't really matter, for nothing matters anymore. Each and every hour is the same. I fancy I can see a figure approaching on my left. Maybe it's a ghost. I can't hear any footsteps, and there's no reason for anyone to be wandering about. We are all supposed to be sleeping.
The figure that Joe Murray had seen turned out to be his CO, Lieutenant Commander Bernard Freyberg, checking up on his men ahead of the attack to wish them luck and doing his best really to keep morale high. And Freyberg is another chap who is going to help us tell the story today. He was born in Surrey. His family moved to New Zealand when he was just a toddler, where he became a very successful competitive swimmer and qualified as a dentist. When war broke out, though, he was straight back to England to join the Royal Naval Brigade. And in late 1914, he actually met with Churchill, who he convinced to grant him a commission into Hood Battalion, with whom he served with distinction at Gallipoli. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order in Gallipoli, actually. So this guy has been with the R&D since the beginning. He's very experienced, and he's already, shown his mettle, basically. Freyberg formed his men up, one man to approximately every 2 yards or so. Behind Hood Battalion were Drake Battalion and one Honourable Artillery Company, and on their left flank was Hawke Battalion, so Douglas Gerald's battalion to the left of Hood. Conditions were tough, and though it was no longer raining, the mud and cold persisted, and a very, very thick fog lingered in the dark over the battlefield. Don't forget, we're near a river, and we all know the kind of difficult conditions that kind of rise early in the morning around a river with all its tributaries running off and around it. Let's head back now to Douglas Gerald of Hawke to describe the minutes before the men left their trenches.
As the moment drew close, we were silent. The whole world was silent, and God, still in his heavens, must have received the prayers of very many sinners turning their thoughts to him, as all men must do in articulo mortis, a call for mercy from what was an ill-assorted cohort of the undeserving. I had my watch by me, and it was the second hand that I was watching.
The tension was lifted when the British artillery opened up and the first wave of troops left their trenches and disappeared off into the mists of no man's land. Freyberg describes the view from Hood Battalion's front.
At 05:45 hours to the second, the whole sky in the rear was suddenly lit up by hundreds of flashes, and the guns had fired. The sound reached us some seconds later, and about 7 seconds after the sound, thousands of shells passed a few feet over our heads and burst in an impenetrable wall 150 yards beyond. Our 12 waves were now running hard to get clear of the enemy counter-barrage, which we knew was due to fall in our assembly trenches in 8 minutes.
Though the fear of this incoming counter-barrage that Freyberg had was totally legitimate, across the Royal Naval Division's frontage, things appeared to be going okay initially, as far as it's possible to tell anyway, in the dark mists and the muddy landscape with the deafening artillery pouring down like rain. There were no masses of wounded coming back. There wasn't any negative news coming back that there were any problems with the first wave of attacks, but equally there had been no word at all from the COs of Hawke Battalion, of Nelson, of Howe, of Anson, or of 1 and 2 Royal Marine Light Infantry who were on the left of the R&D. News was eventually received from Hood Battalion though. Freyberg had followed his men across the battlefield through a rather chaotic initial barrage, which had fallen short in some areas and caused a number of casualties. And we're actually now following that route that the men of Hood Battalion took. And we can see on this shot how much the land actually rolls down towards the valley of the Ancre, and how the Hood Battalion had this kind of almost a kind of shelter from the other side of the R&D, which other battalions didn't get to benefit from. Through the haze and the metal, Hood pushed forward. They eventually quickly reached their first objective, the Blue Line. And this area around the railway was heavily fortified by the Germans. And there were a number of very deep dugouts here, which Hood threw phosphorus bombs down to try and flush out the occupants. It was really vital to ensure that all of these deep dugouts had been completely emptied to avoid the men being cut off from behind, Communication at this point was very, very difficult. And of course, they had to keep the way back to the British front line open. That was a huge priority. Just to illustrate the difference in trenches that we're talking about here, I've kind of explained where the British first came from, while the German trenches and where they were coming from was completely different. These dugouts weren't just like holes in the earth. They were deep warrens of tunnels. They had electric lights. Some of them had lifts even. And so capturing these and securing them was no mean feat, but Hood managed to do it. However, there was a machine gun here, which we can see on this shot has been illustrated with the little icon there. And that proved to be a huge risk for the rest of the R&D from enfilading fire. So essentially, this machine gun could fire at an angle across the R&D's front and sweep across, as it were, to cause a lot of casualties from the right side. And this was holding some men of Hood up in their advance. And that's where this chap comes into the picture. This is Fred Kelly. He was a former Olympic rower and a very good friend of Rupert Brooke. The night before, Kelly had spent his time in the trenches, like many men, writing a letter to his sweetheart, the Hungarian star violinist Jeli Deranyi, whom he also composed a sonata for that night. Sent that off in the post, and what he didn't realise, and certainly what she had no idea was coming, was that was going to be the last correspondence she would ever receive from him, and she would never see him again, as Freyberg explains.
Owing to heavy casualties, it was never really known how it all happened, but it appears that someone on Kelly's left had missed a dugout entrance from which the enemy was shooting. The situation was critical. Unless the strong point was captured at once, enemy machine guns would pop up everywhere. Hesitation would have endangered the success of the whole attack on our front. Kelly, being an experienced soldier, knew this quite well, and he must have known the risk he was taking when, with a few men, he rushed the machine gun. A few of the men reached the position, but Kelly, with most of them, was killed at the moment of victory.
And that, of course, is a picture there of Kelly's grave. He's buried at Commonwealth War Grave Commission Martinsart Cemetery. And there's a story that his sweetheart, Jeli, was woken at 2 a.m. on the 14th of November by the sound of the violin sonata being played. And she said later that it sounded as if it was being played by a bad violinist, by someone who had just played it for the first time, something like that, and that it was coming across a large body of water, so it was echoey, basically. And she was convinced, utterly convinced, that this was Kelly saying a final goodbye to her. Despite numerous proposals, and you can look up this lady on YouTube, she was an incredibly successful violinist. She was very beautiful. Despite proposals, she never married, and she apparently kept a photo of Kelly on her piano for the rest of her life. And for me, Kelly's story is not just one of bravery; it's one that highlights the fact that each of these men going into battle, everybody that we talk about in the First World War had a family. Every loss doesn't affect just that one person. It leaves behind loved ones whose lives are essentially shattered from this. And I just think that's something that we always need to remember when we're talking about military history. Often we can focus a lot on the action and just kind of a little bit, I guess, overlook the impact that these things have to the individual. Despite suffering casualties, including Kelly, Hood had advanced well into the German third line, and they'd stuck to that creeping barrage and made it to their objective of the Green Line just after Beaucourt Station that we could see on the map. And it's time to pause now to see how the attack was going elsewhere. So we're going to pick up the story of what was happening to Hood's left, so what was happening to Hawke Battalion with Douglas Jerrold, where he and Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Wilson had no communication back whatsoever from the first lot of troops that had gone over, and they had basically no idea what was happening on their front.
Wilson was looking more and more troubled. Then suddenly his face cleared of anxiety. Hadn't we better go on and see what's happening? I had laboriously acquired a revolver for the battle, but in my right hand I carried all the documents adjutants are supposed to carry, including even the orders for the battle in case we ever arrived there. We knew enough by now, however, to realise that if we got anywhere at all, it would be by luck, and if we got anywhere near our destination, it would be by using our wits. Then suddenly, as I was trying to think if I'd forgotten anything, I felt a blow and realised that my left arm had been shot off. I remember the story of the Duke of Wellington and Lord Uxbridge. Lord Uxbridge, they shot off my leg, sir. The Duke, by gad, sir, they have. So, like the Duke, I looked round and found my arm hanging somewhere at my back, but alas, no revolver. Oddly enough, I hadn't been knocked out. Indeed, I walked on a few yards looking for my arm, and was really only overcome with the pleasure of finding that it was still there. Then I descended into a shell hole, and Wilson relieved me of such papers as he wanted one, and one of our other orderlies stayed with me and bandaged my arm, with very great skill, incidentally.
Despite Gerald's rather casual description there of almost having his arm blown off, Hawke Battalion were in very serious trouble. And the drone footage that accompanied that voiceover actually shows the route that Hawke took. And you can see quite clearly from that there was this, this huge kind of lump of earth that was going, that had to get up basically before they could get to their first objective. And a machine gun had been placed directly in front of them, which had survived the initial bombardment, unfortunately. And it was situated on this high ground that was known as the Whaleback Redoubt. And we can see from this drone footage here, as we look on to the side of the attacking front, that this had a clear line of fire basically on Hawke and Nelson battalions, whereas Hood were able to avoid it because they were attacking on the bank of the Ancre, so they had that slight bit of shelter here as it sloped down. And it was down this slope towards the right of the R&D frontage that some men from Hawke Battalion drifted, and they managed to connect with Hood to avoid fire from that machine gun. Among those men was AP Herbert, who we heard from earlier. Machine gun caused massive casualties in Hawke and Nelson Battalion, and it left the left flank of Hood Battalion completely exposed, because it really wiped out, pretty much the first wave of Hawke and the second wave of Nelson Battalion. On Hawke and Nelson's left were Howe and Anson battalions, and they were also really struggling to make their first objective because of fire that was coming in from Y Ravine over towards Beaumont Hamel, in the other sector, the other division sector across the 51st Division sector across to the left of the R&D. And it was here that Lieutenant Maynard and Lieutenant Delamotte were killed in fierce fighting further up on this Whaleback Redoubt, this section of high land that drifted across the divisional boundary there. And when it was all said and done, only 20 men of Howe Battalion reached the blue line. So only 20 men made it to that first objective. Here, detachments from Anson, who had followed them, passed through them to get to the green line just outside of Beaucourt. But these two had suffered massive casualties because they not only had the machine gun firing at them from Whaleback Redoubt, they also had the fire coming in from Y Ravine. All told, only about 180 men made it across no man's land on that sector of the front. Things were going even worse for the furthest left sector of the Royal Naval Division's front. The 1st Battalion Royal Marine Light Infantry advanced. They met basically the brunt of the German counter barrage head on. They suffered massive casualties in no man's land, pretty much wiped out the battalion. All company commanders were killed. Captain Loxley, Captain Hoare, Brown and Sullivan, they were all killed. Nobody was leading them by this point. Following them, the 2nd Battalion Royal Marine Light Infantry didn't fare much better. And those guys that did make it across joined the survivors of the 1st Battalion, really showing that true Royal Marine spirit. They managed to take the 3rd German Trench and make it to that blue line. The drone footage that we've just seen here shows, again, we're looking basically towards the Royal Marine Light Infantry sector, and you can see the far side, we've got Beaumont Hamel, and we've got areas of Newfoundland Park there as well, Newfie Park, and you can see just how exposed this land that they're attacking across was. Bear in mind there's very little cover, all these trees, all of that kind of stuff is all gone, so you're really just relying on the lay of the land to provide you some protection, and there's absolutely nothing here. But despite all of this, somehow the Royal Marines Light Infantry managed to make it across, and they managed to get to Station Road, where they dug in despite this continuous shelling from Germans. So why had things gone so wrong? This is a good time to kind of come back to what I mentioned earlier about artillery tactics. So whilst there have been those significant improvements from the 1st of July, the BEF essentially still believed that the initial artillery barrage or the creeping barrage would be enough to destroy all of German defences. And one thing that was made clear after the Battle of the Ancre was that this definitely wasn't the case. Although the creeping barrage did help, and it was far more effective in providing that initial curtain of coverage to troops, it largely was still pretty much ineffective against strongholds. So things like machine gun posts, these redoubts, these big dug-in positions, essentially the artillery didn't, the guys could take cover. They weren't affected by this. It wasn't pleasant, but they remain largely unaffected. And the tactics that were developed to deal with this didn't really come into play fully until 1917. We had the use of phosphorus bombs that I mentioned earlier. They were kind of the precursor to the kind of raiding party, the close grouping of using these small arms fire and bombs and things like that to flush out these defences rather than relying just on artillery. It's a bit doom and gloom. It's not looking good for the RND at this point, but there was some success. In those early minutes after Z hour, if we look towards the left flank of the R&D, we have the 51st Division. And though it's not our point of focus for today, it is always worth exploring what happened on the flanks because, of course, that affects what happens in the centre of an attack. And this drone footage shows Newfie Park, which some of them, may be familiar with, particularly Ed. And you can see here the preserved trenches, which are incredible. If you ever do get the chance to visit the Somme, I fully recommend visiting Newfie Park for this view. We've got the British front line, we've got the German front line in the distance there. And the 51st Division, who were attacking over this ground again in November, they were very successful. They managed to take Beaumont-Hamel. And of course, the Hawthorne Crater, I've got a shout out to the Hawthorne Crater Association, which I'm an honorary member of, and those guys have done great work. This mine essentially that was detonated on the 1st of July, again, it was detonated a second time in November, and they'd learnt their lessons. It wasn't detonated too early, and it allowed for the 51st Div to push forward and capture these key areas. Okay, so let's have a brief time check. It's 7:30 a.m. now, so it's nearly 2 hours after the first battalions of the R&D left their trenches. On the far right, in support of Hood, were Drake Battalion and the 1st Honourable Artillery Company. And the original plan had been for Hood to pause their advance at the Green Line, where Drake and the Honourable Artillery Company would leapfrog over them, they would pass through to push on to the Yellow Line. But Drake Battalion had been hit very hard by that machine gun on Royal Naval Redoubt. They drifted off course and they drifted into its line of fire. In the confusion of the advance, and as such, they'd suffered heavy casualties. Only 3 officers and 70 men arrived at that Green Line objective. Essentially the story of what happened on the left side of the R&D, so the Royal Marine Light Infantry, that story repeated itself somewhat to the right side. So Freyberg here, leading Hood Battalion, pretty much the only success so far. He'd had a tough decision to make. This protective barrage was due to move forward. It's a creeping barrage. It's a continuous movement. Should he take charge and move forward with Hood Battalion? They were meant to stay put. Should he move those guys forward, knowing that his left flank was wide open, knowing that Hawke and Nelson had huge problems, risking essentially encirclement, or should he hold fast on that Green Line and essentially risk the failure of the whole attack? He decided to go for it and advanced up the slopes towards the Yellow Line, and he managed, with his ragtag collection of men, to capture Engine and Beaucourt trenches just outside the village. By this point, news of the attack's progress or lack of it had finally made it back to General Shute, who, pretty fearful that Freyberg was going to push on further still to the Red Line, even though the rest of the R&D had very limited success, and Shute was worried that Freyberg was going to get completely cut off. So he made a call. He instructed the divisional artillery to hold fast, not to move that barrage forward, and just to maintain that constant artillery barrage just ahead of the Yellow Line outside of Beaucourt village to stop Freyberg from advancing any further forward. And there's a very important point to make here about command and control. We often hear criticism of generals in the First World War, along the lines of, well, why didn't they stop the attack when they knew it was going wrong? Why did they let their men keep going when it was obvious there were going to be more casualties? All these kind of things. And these statements are, firstly, mainly a result of hindsight. Obviously, at the time, we don't have that. And B, they totally ignore essentially the practical communication problems of communication on battlefields. The photo that we can see here just gives you an idea of how difficult it would have been to communicate, to have that back and forth chatter between the front line and the rear commanders. The technology at the time wasn't great, of course. They didn't benefit from things we have today. They relied on telephone communication using wires. Often this got blown to pieces by artillery fire. So then they would send out runners. These sometimes got killed. These chaps often took hours to traverse relatively short land because of obviously the chaos of battle. One of the most reliable forms of communication in the First World War was actually pigeons, carrier pigeons, something like a 97% success rate, but this wasn't available to everybody. So, looking at this particular battle, what we see is a very good example of how the communication which survived. They dug the signal lines in very deeply, and they took it as a big priority in this part of the battle. What we see is how vital those effective communications were to the outcome of the battle. Shute made a decision based on the information that was coming from the front to delay that planned assault on the Red Line, and it gave the Royal Naval Division time to consolidate, time to recover, recoup their losses somewhat from the unexpected difficulties that they'd faced on the centre of their attacking line. Shute instructed Freyberg to dig in and prepare for a new assault, a new plan that would start the next morning on the 14th. So again, let's just take a moment to summarise where we are. We're at about 5-6 p.m. on the 13th. From right to left, we've got Hood, plus some stray men from Drake Battalion, Nelson and Hawke who've drifted over, and Honourable Artillery Company. They're holding the yellow line from Ancre up to the railway alley with the 7th Royal Fusiliers and the rest of the Honourable Artillery Company holding the green line behind them. So we've got success on that right side, more or less. Towards the centre and the left of the R&D, the green line is being held by other elements of the 188th and 190th Brigade, but the yellow line has not been captured. So we've got this big slope basically across the R&D frontage, and the guys on the centre and left are facing heavy resistance. Hawke, Nelson, Drake, Royal Marines Light Infantry have lost many men, and the majority of their remaining troops are still in the German frontline system trying to push forward. By 10 p.m, a message to Beaucourt from HQ is sent to try and steady these guys who obviously know things aren't going to plan. The message reads, "The Corps Commander congratulates commanders and troops, including the heavy and field artillery, on their magnificent and successful efforts today under very trying conditions. The Commander-in-Chief has unofficially expressed his satisfaction. Stick it." And before we look at the attack that was due to come on the following morning, let's just take a quick detour to look at the R&D's right flank. The 39th Division had launched their attack on St Pierre Divion, and again, we are looking now towards the 39th Division, from the 39th Division's point of view, just to the left of that Schwaben Redoubt that we saw earlier. The 39th Div had a very, a pretty successful day. They've managed to meet their objectives. They captured the little hamlet there of St Pierre Divion, and this would prove very significant for the Royal Naval Division because it means that they were actually able to support the Royal Naval Division across the Ancre. They could provide that additional manpower, that additional counter battery fire, that kind of stuff that was going to help the R&D in their advance to Beaucourt on the 14th. The night of the 13th then, that was very difficult. There was almost ceaseless German artillery fire, pounding the outskirts of Beaucourt village. And the plan for the morning of the 14th was essentially that the men on the right, our ragtag collection of elements of Hood and various other battalions, was going to kick off and go for the full attack on Beaucourt. There's only around 800 men, so we're not talking of a lot of guys here to take the village. The rest of the R&D, their objective was simply to get to that yellow line to finally crack those defences, and they would have support from the 51st Division, who they'd hooked up with on their left flank. After a brief artillery barrage in the morning then, the remaining elements of Hawke and Nelson in the centre, with 2 battalions of the 111th Brigade who had been brought in to support the Hawke and Nelson, who had been pretty hard hit on the day before, they made their way towards the yellow line. Once again, though, they found themselves in the path of an enemy machine gun, which caused a large chunk of men to drift off again towards the right, following that lay of the land down the Ancre Valley towards Beaucourt village. And what this meant is that a large chunk of the yellow line was actually left unoccupied. The Germans had left it, they'd moved back, utilising that defence in depth, but there was a risk they were going to counterattack. And of course, we've got Hood on the right here ahead of Beaucourt in the yellow line, and so his left flank again was pretty much unoccupied for the beginning of the attack on the 14th, although eventually they did manage to capture it. But this was a scary period, and things have been different. This leaving this area unoccupied could have really been the end of things. Meanwhile, further up on the R&D's front, our General Shute came up trumps again, and he'd arranged for a new weapon to be deployed to help Howe and Anson on the centre-left to help their attack to finally crack that German line. 3 tanks had been brought up during the night, and it was left to Lieutenant Alan Campbell to take them into battle. And remember, this is a new and terrifying weapon. Jumping into the tank, Lieutenant Campbell basically took control of what was going to happen here. He led the tanks across no man's land. The ground was really bad, really, really bad. And just as one tank received a hit from a German shell, another one, so the second tank, immediately became bogged down. And these things are, they're not very maneuverable. I've driven one. I've been lucky enough to drive a Mark IV tank, and I tell you, it's not somewhere you want to be inside one of them. And although they look pretty formidable, actually, in the mud on the battlefield, they are not very maneuverable at all. So 2 of the tanks have been knocked out. Campbell, however, is in this first tank, and he's still trundling across no man's land. Eventually, his tank becomes stuck as well, but luckily, his 6-pounder, or the 6-pounder of the tank that was being driven by the tank commander, was in line of German defences. And I don't know, whether it was the sight of the tank, whether it was the fire from a 6-pounder even. But at this point, maybe it was just sheer exhaustion. The Germans raise a white flag, and the entire garrison in this strong point empties out. About 500 men were taken prisoner. So finally, the guys from Howe and Anson are having some success. As the left of the R&D were making this bit of progress, the mishmash of men that Freyberg was leading made their move towards Beaucourt village. Captain Montague explains what happens next.
The snipers and enemy machine guns were so active that it was dangerous to show your head, even for an instant. We were due to attack at 7:45. Our barrage became a little more intense, but nothing like enough to stop the snipers and machine guns. I saw Freyberg jump out of the trench and wave the men on. 3 men followed from my trench, then I got out with my runner, with the bullets raining past us, one through my sleeve. The first wave stopped 3 times. Freyberg was knocked clean over by a bullet, which hit his helmet, but he got up again. My runner and I dived into a shell hole and waited about half a minute. I said I would get back and get some more men out of the trench, and crawled about 10 yards back to do so. About a dozen men came out, and I got up and waved the rest on. They all followed. We soon got to Beaucourt, absolute ruins of course, and found that the Germans would not face our men and were surrendering in hundreds. It was an amazing sight. They came out of their holes, tearing off their equipment. They offered us goods and souvenirs, and were only too anxious to propitiate us.
Now, although the initial attack was obviously pretty hairy, I don't know whether the Germans were just exhausted or what was going on. But I think by this point, the Royal Naval Division lads must have, hardly believed their luck, because the Germans basically came out with their hands up and surrendered in a huge, huge number. Montague later said as they entered the village that one thing that stuck with him in his mind, despite everything he'd seen, one thing that really stayed with him was the sight of a German spaniel sitting in the mouth of a dugout surrounded by dead German soldiers. And he writes something like, all his friends were gone and he was just sat there staring at us strangers. And, again, I'm just going to kind of make a point here about animals in the First World War. It's an area that I specialise in. And it's funny how, those often come up time and time again in soldier memoirs. It's almost as if, you know, the lack of humanity in the First World War is kind of highlighted by all the things that actually aren't human. And I just want to make a quick note here on prisoners of war. The footage that you're seeing is actually from the film, the propaganda film, The Battle of the Ancre, and there are German POWs there that we're talking about, and they're being taken to the rear lines. Over 8 million men were taken prisoner of war during the First World War. It's a huge, huge number. And although all nations had agreed to adhere to Hague Conventions, so they'd adhered to the rules that meant that they protect the welfare of POWs, it wasn't always the case. And although the majority of German prisoners of war were treated reasonably well by the British, there were unfortunately accounts of some men being executed. And of course, that, you know, there are also likewise many incidents recorded of Allied prisoners of war also being treated awfully. So when I look at the faces of these men in this footage, you know, the war is not over for them by any stretch of the imagination. And I can only really, though it's the enemy and all of the rest of that, everybody is human, and everybody were all kind of equal on some level. And yeah, these guys, I can't imagine what was going through their mind as this was being filmed, quite frankly. Now that Beaucourt had been captured, the R&D set about consolidating the position. They had a few things going on still. They had enemy snipers who still hadn't surrendered, but they wanted to just make safe the village and deal with those last few things that were holding them up. They wanted to mop up, essentially. And just as Freyberg and Montague were discussing their successes, you know, finally capturing the village, and we're looking at a street view here of the bustling village of Beaucourt. Just joking, it is very small. That's what I was mentioning earlier. So whilst Freyberg and Montague were here, maybe in this spot even, discussing their successes, German shelling began to rain down on the village. Dozens and dozens of 5.9 howitzers opened up. The shells were dropping everywhere. And the men who'd survived the past 24 hours, these grueling conditions, they got through all of this to finally reach this objective. They were finding themselves now in this hellish landscape, basically, desperately trying to find cover in a small village of what was left of the village. The pink dust of the remaining buildings filled the air, along with the smell of cordite. It was just chaos, basically. Montague at this point is knocked down, and Freyberg was desperately trying to organise his men to take cover. And in his memoir, he describes what happens next.
There was a bang, a curious ringing tone in my ear, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, my head gave me a good deal of pain, and I lay face downwards, hot blood dropping from my nose and chin. I thought at first my head had been smashed, but I located the wound in my neck with 2 dirty fingers. I looked at the man on my left. He was curled up. I moved his head and found he was grey and dead. Montague was also hit by the same shell, but not badly. He came across to me at considerable risk and bound up my neck, saying, "God, how you bleed."
Despite his injuries, Freyberg was simply not ready to throw in the towel, but Montague was really deeply concerned about his friend. He was convinced, actually, that he was going to die. As he lay there, though, with blood pumping out of his neck, a very, very serious wound, his main concern was not seeking medical attention. No, it was actually who was going to take over command, what was going to happen to his men. And so he got up. He said to Montague, "What can we do? Can we get back to HQ?" And Montague, surprised, looked at him and just said, "Yeah, sure. We'll try." And so together, they both staggered back to Brigade HQ. Freyberg passed on the latest situation report of what was happening in Beaucourt before finally making his way to the dressing station. And they passed many, many dead and wounded on their way. Freyberg had said that, it was his dream to capture Beaucourt. He was absolutely dedicated to his work. Walking back across that battlefield, feeling potentially that you're going to die, you've got this very serious injury going on, for your only concern to be that continued kind of support, that continued kind of dedication to the goal and to try and protect the remainder of your men, it says an awful lot about his character. Finally, covered in blood, white as a sheet, he made his way into the medical tent. The guys in the casualty evacuation chains, it's kind of how it worked, right? They'd look at people and they'd say, "Right, we think you can be saved. Go to this tent." You look like you've got a serious injury, go to this tent and you basically sit there and wait to die. It's very, very harsh, but they had to filter the casualties somehow because there were so many. And so the doctor there looks at Freyberg, he sends him to the tent for those who were not expected to survive. In his memoir, Freyberg writes that just before he lost consciousness, as he's lying in this tent, he hears this gentle voice talking to someone in the background, and he is moved to the other tent where he finally receives some treatment. He survives and he's evacuated back to England, but such were the severity of his injuries. He was not just shot in the neck, he'd been wounded twice previously during this attack, that he was still bedridden by mid-December, when he found out that he'd actually been recommended for the Victoria Cross for his bravery and his inspirational leadership during this attack. And I think it's fair to say, as we come to the end of this tour, that without Freyberg, the outcome of the Battle of the Ancre would certainly have been different. He was a very, very special individual. He went on to serve with distinction after this. He served in the Second World War, and he became a bit of a hero back in Britain and indeed in New Zealand as well. So heading back to what happened after Freyberg got injured, well, the German artillery barrage on Beaucourt finally subsided on the evening of the 14th, and the Royal Naval Division were able to consolidate the village and secure their flanks, connecting with two corps to secure the line as well. And they were finally relieved on midnight on the 14th by the 37th Division. And although they'd not exactly met their objectives, they hadn't quite got to that red line, their final positions were a success. They'd managed to take Beaucourt, and the other guys towards the centre and left had managed to pretty much knock out that German salient. They'd managed to get to that yellow line just beyond it. But it was hugely costly. In the month of November, the Royal Naval Division had lost 100 officers and more than 1,500 men, with a further 2,500 officers and men wounded. Huge, huge numbers. Overall, though, the Battle of the Ancre had been an outstanding success for the Allies. The Germans had been removed from one of their last areas of high ground. The immensely strong defences in the area had been broken down. On the flanks of the R&D, the 51st Division had captured Beaumont-Hamel, the 39th had captured St Pierre Divion, and so really this had been what Haig had hoped for. And the footage here is from the Battle of the Ancre again, and this is the R&D. This is the Royal Naval Division enjoying the spoils of their victory in Beaucourt village. They've got their souvenirs of battle. They've got their souvenirs they picked off of the German soldiers as they were surrendering. I just think this is incredible footage, especially when we consider what these lads have been through. The Ancre had taught the British a lot of lessons. A lot of lessons had been put into practice, but a lot more had been learned. The adjusted creeping barrage had been more accurate, had been more effective, but not totally. The efforts to take time in consolidating positions, that was another big thing. We weren't taking these huge jumps, we were taking small bites, and we were taking our time to try and get those lines secured, dig in before pushing forward. All of that proved super valuable as we look at what happened in 1917. And it gave, as I said, it gave Haig what he needed. He went to the Chantilly conference, and the R&D really solidified their place as basically a Stormer division. They were used in 1917 and 1918. And yeah, I'm going to leave the nearly final word with Montague as he discusses his thoughts looking back over the Battle of the Ancre.
There are just one or two things that I would like to record before I leave Beaucourt. One is that I lost my stick, a Malacca cane given me at Monte Carlo, which I had with me all the time at Gallipoli, as well as on many a racecourse. I lost it under the brick wall at the same time as the pâté de foie gras when the heavy shelling started. Another is that when we were lying in the trench expecting a counterattack, we got the greatest confidence from our aeroplanes, which went up and down quite low over the German lines, signalling to us and peppering them with machine gun. It seemed to be the master of the whole situation had a strong link with the higher command. The next morning we left a party to help collect wounded and move back. The divisional general met us and thanked us again, saying we had done simply splendidly. Sir Douglas Haig came and spoke to us the same afternoon, shook hands with most of us, and was very complimentary. I'm awfully glad the Hood has done so well. I always thought that it was a magnificent division with splendid officers and men.
whilst Montague talking there about his foie gras Russian break being interrupted and losing his cane is pretty funny and shows that R&D spirit. Like many accounts from these old hands, it really majorly downplays the horrors of war. And to end, I want to share with you another poem by A.P. Herbert, and this couldn't be any more different from the poem that we heard previously. He was not only talented and funny guy, he was an incredible writer. And this poem, it just never fails to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. And in the video, you'll see that we set it with, you'll see a shot of British Cemetery, which was situated just to the rear of where the R&D left on the morning of the 13th, and where many of them now rest in perpetuity.
I wandered up to Beaucourt. I took the river track and saw the lines we lived in before the Boche went back. But peace was now in pottage. The front was far ahead. The front had journeyed eastward and only left the dead. And I thought how long we lay there and watched across the wire, while guns roared round the valley and set the skies afire. But now there are homes in Hamel and tents in the Vale of Hell, and a camp at Suicide Corner where half a regiment fell. The new troops follow after and tread the land we won. To them 'tis so much hillside we wrested from the Hun. We only walk with reverence this sullen mile of mud. The shell holes hold our history, and half of them our blood. Here at the head of Pest Street, 'twas death to show your face. To me it seemed like magic to linger in the place. For me how many spirits hung round the Kentish caves, but the new men see no spirits, they only see the graves. I found the half-dug ditches we fashioned for the fight. We lost a score of men there. Young James was killed that night. I saw the star shells staring. I heard the bullets hail. But the new troops pass unheeding. They never heard the tale. I crossed the blood-red ribbon that once was no man's land. I saw a misty daybreak and a creeping minute hand. And here the lads went over, and there was Harmsworth shot, and here was William lying, but the new men knew them not. And I said, there is still the river, and still the stiff, stark trees, to treasure here our story, but there are only these. But under the whitewood crosses, the dead men answered low. The new men know not Beaucourt, but we are here, we know.
Such a beautiful poem. I think actually A.P. Herbert's just got to be one of my favourites in terms of First World War literature. And yeah, every time I go to Ancre British Cemetery, I think about this poem, and just it brings home everything. Despite the humour, despite the the personalities in R&D, and we've had some light-hearted moments in this tour. This really puts in perspective what it's all about, essentially. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the tour, and I'm sure there'll be a couple of questions coming up. But yeah, thank you for joining us tonight, and hopefully for those who are able, you'll be able to get out and see the ground, and that this will help you understand what happened there.
So here we are back, ladies and gents, and back with Lucy once again. Again, the darker haired version of Lucy, but equally impressive with that tour de force. Thank you ever so much for that. Really, really fascinating. Such a powerful story. And thank you very much for you guys coming along and joining us. We have a chance for a Q&A session now. So lots of opportunities. Any questions that you've got, do please feed them in. We've got the chat live in front of us here, so I'm more than happy to discuss those elements. And of course, we've got about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and we can mention a couple of bits that we've got coming up in the meantime. If I could start, though, just whilst we're waiting for a few questions to come in, with a quick request, because it's so important for us with this new format we're using right here on YouTube. If you feel so inclined, of course, do please just scroll down a little bit and just hit that like button here on YouTube. Drop us a quick comment, let us know what you thought of the tour. It really helps the famous YouTube algorithm and give us at least a little bit of information, and it helps us improve what we do in terms of building tours going forwards as well. So it gives us great feedback, and of course we do have time now to go through with some questions for Lucy. I've noticed a couple here, Lucy, actually in the chat throughout the tour. So I know one of your favourite characters here. We've got John McGagan's asking, what was the story of Gerald's sort of future life and more? Do you know anything about him?
Yeah, Douglas Gerald, very interesting chap. Actually, he's one of the reasons I first got into finding out a bit more about the Royal Naval Division was because he published a number of books on the division about his wartime experiences. And the way they are written is, in some ways, they're your kind of typical, divisional histories. Quite kind of matter of fact and the rest of it. And then there are sections of them which are just fantastically entertainingly written, very funny, very dry, including all kinds of anecdotes that you wouldn't normally find in such books. So that led me to kind of dig further deeper actually into the Royal Naval Division. He was a quite an accomplished writer in the 30s, published a lot of books. He was also before the war, Tory, into politics a great deal, became very disillusioned with what was happening across Europe after the First World War, and became a big fascist sympathiser. By no means a Nazi, but very much into fascism. And he actually, I think I mentioned in the tour, actually became quite central to Franco's move from the Canary Islands to Morocco, which obviously then kick-started the Spanish Civil War. And he wrote all about this in a book called The Georgian Adventure, which it's kind of like his autobiography. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you can. But yeah, very, very interesting man. He joined the January Club, so Mosley's kind of organisation that he set up to kind of spread fascism throughout Britain in the 30s. And just throughout the rest of his life, really, was just very vocal, would apparently love to write angry letters to anybody who criticised him or disagreed with him. And I just think he would just be one of those fascinating people to have around a dinner table. And I feel like that's, actually quite reflective of a lot of the characters in the Royal Naval Division.
Absolutely. You probably want to keep them away from too much wine, though, with those kind of strong opinions. But yeah, very absolutely. Much so. It reminds me, actually, whilst you were saying that, a lot of these guys go on to great and really prosperous careers, actually. AP Herbert, of course, being one. For those that are not aware, he goes into politics as well, is famously an MP, a wartime MP, in fact, and refuses a commission and proudly turns up to the House of Commons in his able seaman's uniform, and is pretty proud of that. The story that AP Herbert really reminds me of, though, is his experience in the Second World War, because he's in that kind of London elite world and lifestyle. So his best mates, the curator of the British Museum and various others, and he spends a lot of his time on the River Thames, sort of moving around in his little motor yacht and drinking a lot of champagne and various other bits. And he manages to convince Parliament to create, I forget the name, but somebody maybe in the chat can tell us here. It's like the Royal Navy Thames Patrol Squadron or something like that, just for him and his 4 or 5 mates, who managed to acquire a couple of Lewis guns and spend their evenings drinking champagne on the Thames and shooting at Luftwaffe aircraft with Lewis guns, which is it's just fantastic. What a character he is. So
absolutely.
The R&D, as I think you painted really, really beautifully, actually, are a real group of a real character as a group, but also as individuals as well. So no doubt we'll come back and revisit their story in a future virtual tour. Just want to dip into a couple of other questions here. So as we go through, what have we got here? So a little bit of talk about Freyberg here, Benny Freyberg, the New Zealander. He goes on to fairly high command, doesn't he? I believe he's in command in Crete during the Second World War, the famous German paratrooper landing and various other things. Doesn't perhaps show his best in some instances there. But
no, but I mean, he was I think he was sorry, Dan, to talk over you. I think he was promoted to brigadier general in the first. I think he was one of the youngest sort of like general officers in the First World War, his promotion wise, and sort of went on to just have like an incredible military service. I know he didn't have his finest hours, but he was in North Africa, I think, as well, in Italy, and it's like, you know, I think it was mentioned in dispatches like 5 or 6 times or something, DSO and bar, you know, just phenomenal service overall, I think. And again, he went on to, I think he was involved in politics. He became like maybe the governor of New Zealand, I'm not quite sure,
Absolutely.
something like that. Yeah. And one thing I found out about him, which, you know, something just to kind of reflect on, we often say, you know, obviously the war didn't end for these guys, you know, after they kind of stepped out of uniform, and Freyberg was actually died as a result of his injuries that he sustained, you know, during the war. I think one of his injuries killed him eventually in the 60s. So those are kind of things that we kind of important to remember, and that's partly why I do these tours as well, is to focus on the people and just the fact that, you know, these things had such long-term consequences for the individuals.
Absolutely, you know, First World War casts a very long shadow, as I'm sure so many of these guys would have experienced firsthand as well. But you do raise a really good point there, actually. And I think I know it's something that I'm interested in. I know it's a passion of yours as well. And, you know, you did touch on it during the tour, so maybe we should expand on that briefly. You said, you know, Freyberg being a very young brigadier general, and the story of kind of senior officers. I think to an extent we've debunked some of that with this evening's tour, you know, looking at kind of the reality of what the role was for the senior officer. I mean, 26 years old, I think, is the youngest brigadier in the First World War. Roland Boys Bradford, another VC recipient. Absolutely incredible. But and you mentioned this in terms of communication, that's really the big issue, isn't it, in terms of command and control. Once things start moving, there's a pretty limited amount a senior officer can do, at least in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in terms of communication, I think that's actually, you know, super apparent here. And I mentioned, obviously, in the tour, we focused on the decisions that Schwaben made, you know, to postpone the attack and then to have another bite of it the day after. And, you know, that's an example of when the communications could get back, when those messages were received and that conversation could happen. You know, of course, the senior officers, commanding officers wanted to make the best decisions. You know, it's not a case of that they just didn't care and they continued. You know, these guys are trained to succeed, you know, and of course, that's what they would do if they had the chance. And so, yeah, I think, you know, communication could only go as far as it could in the First World War because of the technology. You know, there are only so many things that could be done. And I just think we need to try and focus on the examples where those things, you know, they did come off and where it was possible to have that back and forth. And also what they instilled rather in the officers on the ground, that initiative, you know, which we see that developing throughout the First World War in the British Army, of that kind of control on the ground and making those decisions and empowering the officers that are down there at the front of things to make those decisions for themselves rather than having to wait on orders coming from the rear.
Yeah, absolutely. Entirely, an entire agreement there. You know, these communications in particular, and we spoke about carrier pigeons, which are fantastic and they do the job. Problem is they don't fly backwards afterwards. You know, they're a one-way device. So, and again, like you say as well, you know, and maybe as First World War historians, we're a little biased on this side, but, you know, the Second World War sometimes overshadows the First. But it's always worth remembering, you know, the guys that are the commanders in the Second World War are there because they cut their teeth and they earn their spurs on battlefields like the Ancre. You know, this is where they learn their trade, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is all, you know, this all comes back to this idea that, you know, the British Army at the end of the war was a totally different beast to the British Army at the beginning of it. You know, 1918, the British Army was just a very efficient fighting force. And without those lessons, without those experiences in the First World War, you know, absolutely wouldn't have been in that position you know, come the Second World War. I mean, I try not to get into too much kind of counterfactuals on things because I'm not sure it's entirely productive. But yeah, there's this other side of the coin that I think as military historians we're always trying to show and kind of explore. And at the end of the day, you make your own decisions up about things, but it's about having the facts presented to you, isn't it?
Yeah, Entirely agree. And so does a lot of people on here as well. Really very complimentary about the tour. Very glad you guys enjoyed it. I agree entirely. Real tour de force from Lucy there. And a question has been asked regarding other tours that are available. Yes, absolutely. We have over on the main Battle Guides virtual tours platform, which is battleguide.co.uk. We've got, I think, upwards of 80 virtual tours now covering a real wide range of history. So our earliest is going to be, I think, Agincourt. 1415, and we run right up to Berlin 1945, but we do tend to specialise in the First and Second World War and also the Napoleonics now, so do check those out. And of course, also right here on YouTube, we've got a series of tours as well. We've got a Vimy Ridge virtual tour from Jesse Alexander last month, and we've got a number of shorter form content videos, our latest one being on the Führerbunker, believe it or not, in 1945, and tracking that down. So you can catch those right here free on our YouTube page, so do please check them out if you're so interested. Lots of more exciting stuff coming up again. We'll touch on that in a moment's time. We've got a question from Eddie Muir though, asking when was the R&D actually formed? Was it just pre the start or just after the start of the First World War? I think it's just after, but I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it's just literally just after. And I think the idea had been lingering for some time. You know, it's the brainchild of Churchill to a big degree. But yeah, I believe it was just after.
That's right. Yeah, too many men, not enough ships. So that's the way it works, I think, yes. Broadly. We've got Sverevi here asking, what was the larger strategic value of this victory? Did they continue moving the front in later battles?
That's a good question. I mean, I saw there was another question further up about, you know, what would have happened had the Ancre been a failure. I think it's kind of difficult to say in many ways. I mean, from my perspective, I've kind of always believed that the Ancre was very powerful because of what happened afterwards for Haig at Chantilly. You know, I think had he gone there and actually ended on a really bad note, you know, that there wasn't this kind of positive end to the Somme campaign as we like to think of it, then that would have made it much more difficult to kind of move forward with the French in particular. And of course, having worn the Germans down to the extent that they did, you know, what would have happened if that hadn't have gone? Well, would they have then been able to take more of a force towards the French at Verdun and not relieve that pressure, etc., etc. So, I mean, for me, I think it's this idea of having, okay, we had all these disasters during the Somme. We know it didn't go to plan in the beginning. We know it went on and on. But look, we've ended on this positive note. Look at our new technology that we've got. Look at this. We've managed to push the Germans back off this salient. You know, this kind of impetus to then, yes, we're on a great start now. We can do this. For me, it was more of a kind of psychological, political victory than it was in terms of anything on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, actually, and it's quite a strange thing to consider, actually, when you think about these kind of battles. In that success, really, on the Somme as a whole was measured not by winning the war, but by it carrying on, quite simply by allowing the French to continue the fight. And so, you know, I wonder if that translated to the lads on the ground at the time, and or was it really when you come down to the level of the individual soldier, was it far more basic than that? Was it, I'm here because my mate on my left needs me?
Yeah, I think that's it as well, isn't it? Like, you know, we are looking at things, of course, with hindsight. You know, at the time, I think at the time, you know, and certainly from mentioned earlier, Dan, about how at the beginning of the tour, about how the Royal Naval Division were really seen as this almost this elite fighting force, you know, that they had done incredibly well. And I think that is definitely the case. You know, at the end, I think everybody was very happy with the outcome and they did feel that morale boost from it. But at the same time, for then things to continue on and on, obviously at the time that wider perspective probably was something that you were still grasping for, and that certainly Haig was still trying to make that point. You know, we could have the same conversation sort of mid-1917, right?
Yeah, and actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking it reminded me of taking some Normandy veterans back to the D-Day beaches. Not too long ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember from a personal point of view being really terrified that as a historian who wasn't there in 1944 would be told, no, that isn't how it happened, that isn't what went on, and being really surprised actually that a lot of these veterans who were there in 1944 were asking me, okay, what happened over there, what happened over there? And the same thing applies to the First World War, really, doesn't it? Because, you know, we've been looking at a big picture with drones and satellite imagery tonight to really give us that full picture. But for Private Smith on the ground in B Company of Hood Battalion, his view of the Battle of the Ancre is so limited.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why they say, my war, your war. Everybody had an individual experience. And it's only when, you can look at the different perspectives. Actually, when you take the broader view, yeah, you're going to have a completely different. But actually, a lot of the times, we can refer back to things like the memoirs that were written. The soldier memoirs, of course, paint often a terrible, terrible picture of things, because these guys are talking about the losses that they suffered, the injuries, the horrors that they witnessed. They're not going to be one of writing about what a great success it all was. That's completely understandable. And so I think that's why, what I try to do, I'm not always successful. What I try to do is to take a view in the round, to read my memoirs, read about the experiences of the average man fighting, and also then look at the wider things, not just what's happening from a strategic or grand strategic level, but also, economic things on the home front. You have to try and take in as much information as you can, and then make your own view or your own decisions about where you think what was successful, what wasn't. I think that's the best way to kind of look at stuff. But that's part of the reason I always like to include the personal stories, is at the end of the day, we do military history because we want to remember, the sacrifices that these guys made, and we want to remember that view of the everyman, that's kind of that went there and that saw those things.
Mm-hmm. And for those of us like myself, actually, that have just realised how much you want to get back out to the battlefields by listening to your tour this evening. What would you recommend in terms of somebody that wants to go and visit, not necessarily just the Ancre, but perhaps the Somme more generally? Are there absolute must-sees? Are there any little hidden gems that are worth a look at?
Yeah, look, I think, you're asking somebody who could probably spend 2 weeks just straight on the Somme. If I had to do like a 1 or 2 day things, I definitely want to go to Newfoundland Memorial Park. I think that's a great place to get a view of the battlefields. I'd want to be going to places like up to Beaumont Hamel and exploring the little pathways, walking across. You're doing like an hour, half an hour walk that you can, because pretty much everywhere you're going up there is where these guys were. I'm a big fan of the War Grave Commission cemeteries, and you can almost do like a little tour of them all, and that will broadly follow the front line across those places. And I also love the area around Pozières. That's very different to what we've looked at today. But there's so much to see on the Somme, and actually you can see the differences between sort of the north and south as well. Further south, places like Loch Nagar, seeing the mining operations, Hawthorne Ridge again. There's so much to see. It just very much, I would take your time to think about what it is you want to get out of it. Are you looking to kind of follow in the footsteps of a relative or someone that you've had a connection with, and kind of build your trip up around that is the best way to do it, I think, because you get that personal connection.
Yeah, such an important thing. And I know we've had a number of people commented throughout the tour actually here. They've had relatives, I think someone on the 1st of July and somebody on the 13th of November. And the fascinating and in a way tragic thing is that those two people could fall those 4 months apart, but in the same location. In fact, the very area that we've been looking at this evening was fought over on both of those dates, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And then again, you can also have people who 4 years later were in this, potentially in the same spot. And that's a very powerful thing about the Somme, I think, in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, ladies and gents, if you've got any other questions, do please drop them in. I've got a couple of bits just to mention really briefly, which is, first of all, to thank you all for coming along to join us. This is a pretty new way that we're trying to share history. We've been delivering virtual tours over on our main platform for a couple of years now, but if this is your first exposure to what we do please head over and check it out. We've got a really vibrant community and a great team of historians like Lucy who put these tours together alongside our technical experts, our tour managers, and it's really exciting to be working at this kind of a cutting edge, if you like, of a new way of sharing history from all across the globe. In terms of what we've got coming up in the near future, let's have a quick look if I can bring it up on screen. So every Sunday we deliver a virtual tour. Starting next week, we are covering the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940. That's going to be myself back alongside Dr. Spencer Jones, and we're going to be looking, just to clarify here, this is going to be the retreat to Dunkirk, not the evacuation of. That's going to be a subsequent virtual tour. So we're going to be starting over at Sedan, and heading right back in the footsteps of the French First Army and also the British Expeditionary Force, looking at a couple of those very tragic moments as well that really highlight the brutality of the fighting in 1940, such as the Le Paradis and the Wormwood massacres, amongst others. But it's really fascinating period of history to study, and we've got some exciting new tech to bring in as well, so do come and join us for that one. 2 weeks' time, we'll be back on more familiar ground, this time 1918, following our cousins over in the United States. Marines once again, though. It's got a slightly naval connection. We're going to be looking at the Battle of Belleau Wood, and it's a little bit of a myth-busting tour with Jonathan Bratton, our specialist over in the US, who's going to be joining us to talk us through that one. And then 3 weeks from now, we're heading way back in time to the Battle of Naseby in the English Civil War. We've got Paul Colborne and Shane Greer going to be joining us to take us through, I suppose, one of the pivotal actions of the English Civil War as well. So if you're interested in those, or if you have any suggestions for tours that you guys would like to see in the near future, drop us in, chuck them in the chat, because we're always open to ideas. Some of them are a bit trickier to film than others, but we'll always give it a go, and we're always happy to try and explore these new avenues. What have we got left to cover very briefly? So our main platform, I've just seen the question going there. So it's battleguide.co.uk. So that's our dedicated platform. Some people will be joining from Battleguide tonight, others will be direct on YouTube. But battleguide.co.uk, you can see that our live tours on Sundays, or our entire back catalogue of on-demand tours, which there's plenty there for fellow history geeks like Lucy and I. Final thing, this is just a new one, and I should caveat this by saying absolutely not necessary in any stretch of the imagination, but we do realise, of course, that you guys are absolutely key to our support. If you just check in the link here, there is a link. If you feel so inclined to make a small contribution to supporting what we do, all of that just goes back into helping us create more tours, increasing the quality, and delivering as much good quality historical content as we can. There's a little link there. It's absolutely it's not compulsory in any way, shape or form, but if you feel so inclined, do follow that link. It would be of course much appreciated. So, ladies and gents, that brings us, I think, quite nicely towards the end of this evening's virtual tour. Sincerely hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for giving up your afternoons or evenings, depending where you are in the world. And a huge thank you to Lucy Bettridge-Dyson, not only for the main tour, which we've watched tonight, but also for her excellent appearance in the Q&A and also pre-tour as well. I'm going to hand over to Lucy now for the last few words to round off our evening. And Lucy, what have you got to say?
I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And I would, definitely recommend, if you've enjoyed this and finding out a bit more about the Royal Naval Division, do have a read of Douglas Gerald's books on the subject. I hope that if possible, one day you're able to get out to the Somme to see it on the ground as well. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. See you again soon.